Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really intriguing question that, you might not have pondered before. Does age make it tougher to learn to read fluently?
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
We've got some really interesting research to explore, looking at two very different experiences. Adults in developing countries learning to read for the very first time, and then those of us who are already pretty well read tackling languages with completely new ways of writing.
What's fascinating here, I think, is that we're not just talking about picking up a new language like the speaking part, but about the fundamental mechanics of how your brain actually processes those written symbols. It's about the visual system as much as anything else.
Exactly. And our main guide on this journey is the research paper, Does Age Diminish the Ability to Learn Fluent Reading? By Helena Bodzi. She's really delved into the existing data and put forward a pretty compelling idea about
So, the core of our deep dive today is really to understand the potential obstacles that adults face when they're trying to, unlock reading and to explore the possible underlying reasons for these hurdles.
Right. We want to give you a much clearer picture of the reading process itself and, well, how the passage of time might influence it.
Hmm.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The paper kicks off by looking at adults in literacy programs, and the picture that emerges has some pretty significant challenges.
It does indeed. The research highlights some trends that, well, they might surprise you. For example, the paper notes that dropout rates in these programs often hover around 50%.
50%, wow.
Yeah, think about that. Half the people who start don't actually finish. That represents a huge amount of effort, and resources that just don't come to fruition.
Absolutely. And it doesn't stop there, right?
Yeah.
Even among those who do stick with the courses and complete them.
Well, about half still don't meet the basic reading performance criteria.
Half again.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder what fundamental barriers they're running into. And perhaps most concerning for, sustained literacy is that around half of those who do achieve some literacy end up relapsing back into illiteracy,
Oh, wow.
which suggests that the reading skills they've acquired might not become as deeply ingrained or as readily accessible as we might hope.
It paints a picture of literacy campaigns facing some serious headwinds, in terms of overall effectiveness.
Yeah.
But let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What specific reading difficulties are these adults actually experiencing?
Well, the observations are quite revealing. These new adult readers often read at a noticeably slower pace. They tend to sound out individual letters, even for common words, and they frequently misread words.
Okay.
The paper points out that they often require additional post-literacy training just to navigate materials beyond the very basics, like, simple textbooks.
It sounds like they're not quite reaching that stage where reading feels automatic and effortless the way it does for fluent readers.
Precisely. Even after 2 to 3 years of consistent practice, many don't seem to fully grasp word segmentation, that ability to effortlessly break words down into their component sounds or achieve instant recognition of familiar words.
Right.
And this is a key difference when we compare them to children learning to read in similar environments.
It's quite a contrast, isn't it?
Hmm.
The paper highlights that in those same, often challenging environments, children who have access to effective schooling frequently become fluent readers relatively quickly.
Yeah, it's a stark difference. And what's also significant, I think, is the observation that older adults, particularly those over the age of 40, rarely seem to reach what's termed functional literacy.
Functional literacy, meaning,
Meaning the ability to actually use reading in everyday life, things like understanding instructions, reading a newspaper to get information, that kind of thing.
got it. And the paper even delves into some evaluations, right, from literacy programs in places like Algeria, Tanzania, and Nepal.
Yes, and Bangladesh too. While these evaluations often had to account for other influencing factors like gender and socioeconomic status, stuff like that,
Sure.
a recurring theme was a negative correlation between age and literacy performance. In other words, older participants generally tended to show lower levels of achievement in both reading and writing skills.
So it seems the hurdles faced by adults learning to read for the first time are pretty substantial.
Yeah.
But the paper also examines another fascinating group. Adults who are already educated, fluent readers, but are tackling completely new writing systems. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this provides a really insightful parallel for trying to understand the underlying mechanisms. These are individuals who are already skilled readers in one script, usually the Latin alphabet, right?
Hmm.
But then they decide to learn languages that use totally different scripts, things like Bangla, Japanese katakana, Hebrew, Devanagari, Tibetan, Cyrillic.
Okay. And what are their learning experiences like? You might assume, with their existing reading skills, the process would be much smoother.
Well, interestingly, they often report a relatively quick initial grasp of the letter-sound correspondences. They can often pick up the basic sounds associated with the new symbols in just a few days or weeks.
So far, so good.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They then tend to hit a plateau. Their reading speed improves very, very gradually, even with years of dedicated practice.
A plateau in reading speed,
Hmm.
despite being fluent speakers of the language and having plenty of opportunities to read it. That's really surprising.
It is. They also describe a kind of limited pattern recognition. Instead of seeing words as whole units or recognizing common letter combinations at a glance, they tend to focus on processing individual letters,
Ah, okay.
which makes scanning text efficiently very difficult. They might easily recognize very short, high-frequency words, but anything longer often requires a much more deliberate, like letter-by-letter decoding approach.
That must make the actual act of reading feel quite laborious and, well, tiring.
It absolutely does. Their reading speed in the new script consistently lags behind their reading speed in their native script, even after extensive practice. Some individuals even reported that their reading speed seemed to decrease after periods where they weren't actively reading in the new script.
Really?
And they might even start to forget the shapes of certain letters.
Forgetting letter shapes after years of use. Wow. That sounds quite different from our, ingrained familiarity with our own writing system.
It is. They also tend to make more errors and rely more heavily on context to guess words, so they might predict what a word should be based on the surrounding text rather than accurately decoding the written form itself.
Okay, using context as a crutch almost.
Kind of, yeah. And there's also this persistent need to sound out words, and encountering longer words can be particularly frustrating for them.
It almost sounds like they're perpetually stuck in those very early stages of learning to read, even after putting in significant effort.
That's a sentiment some of them have expressed, yeah. They might feel like they're in a constant beginner phase where reading requires conscious effort and just doesn't become an automatic process. One individual who had read extensively in Devanagari compared their reading fluency after years of practice to that of a first-grade student reading in their native script.
Wow, that really highlights the perceived gap.
It really does.
That's a powerful comparison. And the paper suggests that this difficulty might be more about how we visually perceive the new script rather than a problem with understanding the language itself.
That seems to be the prevailing idea, yes. Even fluent speakers of the language report actively avoiding reading in the new script unless it's absolutely necessary.
Ah,
For instance, they might find it easier to read English words that are written in, say, the tree script, where they already know the meaning, than to read actual Thai text, which suggests that the hurdle really lies in the decoding of the unfamiliar print itself.
okay, that makes sense. So we have these two distinct groups, adults learning to read for the first time and educated adults learning completely new scripts, both encountering significant challenges in achieving fluent, effortless reading. The paper then delves into a theoretical framework to try and explain why this might be the case. Tell us about the Seidenberg and McClellan model.
Right. So this model proposes that reading isn't just one single skill, but involves four interconnected processing mechanisms in the brain. You've got the phonological processor, which deals with sounds.
Okay.
The orthographic processor, handling the visual forms of words.
Right, the shapes.
Meaning processor, accessing word meanings, and the context processor. And all of these are constantly feeding information back and forth to each other in a loop.
Like a network.
Exactly. The visual image of letters is initially processed by that orthographic processor, which then might activate the phonological processor to help figure out if the letter string forms a recognizable sound. This then interacts with meaning and context to help us understand what we're reading.
Okay, so it's a dynamic system where all these different parts of our brain are constantly communicating as we read.
Precisely. And with practice, this whole process becomes highly automatic, right?
Yeah.
We start to recognize familiar letter combinations and whole words as patterns without needing to consciously sound them out. But the paper emphasizes the crucial role of that visual processing, the speed and accuracy of the orthographic processor, in quickly and correctly identifying letters and words.
And how does this relate to the difficulties that adults seem to face when learning to read fluently?
Well, the hypothesis is that if the initial visual perception of letters is slower or maybe less accurate in adults dealing with a new script, the brain might try to compensate by relying more heavily on those other mechanisms, like sounding out words and breaking them down into syllables.
Makes sense.
And while these compensatory strategies can be helpful, they can also slow down the overall reading process and even lead to errors if the initial visual information is misinterpreted, potentially misleading the meaning and context processors.
So it's like a bottleneck occurring at that very initial stage of visually processing the new written symbols.
Exactly. The paper even draws a parallel to a condition called alexia, where individuals can write perfectly well but struggle significantly with reading, often having to decipher words letter by letter.
Right, I've heard of that.
One idea proposed is that as our brains mature, subtle changes in the word recognition spot, a specific area in the visual cortex, might affect its efficiency in processing the visual patterns of a new writing system, hindering that automatic recognition.
So that automatic spell check or visual word recognition that our brains do so efficiently for our native script might not function as effectively for new scripts as we get older. Is that the idea?
That's one of the key hypotheses, yeah. Another related idea is that there might be subtle age-related reductions in the speed of neural impulses in the brain areas responsible for forming visual patterns. This could potentially prevent the simultaneous processing of multiple letters that's needed for recognizing familiar letter combinations as a single unit. It's almost as if the individual letters arrive just a fraction too late to be perceived together as a cohesive word shape.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. I
Yeah.
mean, even as experienced readers, when we try to read a foreign script at our usual pace, we sometimes struggle to see the words as systematic units, right? You can see the individual characters, but not how they combine easily to form recognizable words.
Exactly. And this leads to a really interesting question the paper raises. Could there be a critical period for learning fluent reading, much like the well-known debate around the critical period for acquiring oral language?
Huh. The idea being that younger brains might be more adaptable, more plastic when it comes to this specific type of visual pattern recognition required for reading.
Exactly. The paper points to some compelling parallels with oral language acquisition, where younger learners often achieve near-native fluency more easily in the long run, even if adults sometimes show faster initial progress in things like vocabulary or grammar rules.
Right. The ultimate attainment seems different.
Yeah, and observations in literacy classes involving children, younger adolescents, and adults seem to align with this pattern. Adults might learn the basic letter sounds quickly, but achieving that truly effortless reading fluency seems to be a different story for many.
And what about individuals who learn new scripts later in their teenage years? The paper mentions some interesting anecdotal reports there, too.
Yes, there are accounts of individuals who learned new scripts in their late teens, still reporting later in life that they read slower and maybe with less enjoyment, even after years of consistent reading practice.
Hmm.
However, the paper is careful to note that the exact age at which these difficulties become significant and the extent to which dedicated practice can overcome them at different ages, well, those are still areas where more research is definitely needed.
So this idea of a critical period for fluent reading is a potential framework, a hypothesis maybe, for understanding these challenges, but it's certainly something that requires further investigation. What other supporting evidence does the paper draw upon from related fields of study?
Well, the paper looks at research exploring the relationship between reading fluency and the speed at which we can access information stored in our memory.
Okay.
The idea is if our reaction times and the speed of retrieving information tend to slow down slightly as we age, which they generally do, this could potentially impact how quickly we can retrieve the sounds or meanings associated with letters, thereby affecting our overall reading speed and comprehension.
That makes intuitive sense. Quicker recall of letter sounds and word meanings would likely contribute to faster and more fluent recognition, yeah.
There's also research on how older adults learn motor skills. While they can certainly improve with practice, some studies suggest that they might be less likely to achieve true automaticity in certain tasks, particularly those that involve complex visual searches.
That seems to circle back again to the idea that recognizing letters and words in a new script might not become fully automatic for older learners.
Precisely. The paper also brings in findings from the field of air traffic controller training,
Oh,
where a negative correlation has been observed between age and success in training. This field demands very rapid visual and spatial processing, and the increased difficulty faced by older trainees might suggest similar underlying age-related changes in perceptual processing speed or efficiency.
That's a fascinating and unexpected connection. And what about general cognitive functions? Are age-related declines in overall intellect or maybe motor skills likely to be the primary cause of these reading challenges in adults?
Well, according to the cognitive research cited in the paper, those brighter factors are probably unlikely to be the main obstacles. For example, while studies do show some age-related differences in areas like verbal memory, these differences don't necessarily explain the specific difficulties adults face when learning to read a new script.
So, the evidence seems to consistently point towards a more specific challenge related to the visual processing of new written symbols as we age.
It does seem that way. And the literature on foreign language acquisition also frequently notes the reading difficulties that learners encounter when faced with new scripts, often mirroring the experiences of those learning to read in their first language.
Right.
However, in those cases, it can be challenging to disentangle the difficulties arising from the unfamiliarity of the language itself from those caused purely by the new writing system.
Right. It becomes hard to tell if the struggle is because the language is new and the words are unfamiliar, or because the script itself is just difficult to decode visually.
Exactly. And finally, the field of literacy studies itself occasionally touches on the challenges faced by newly literate adults, leading to this concept of different literacies based on familiarity and practice. You tend to read texts that use familiar vocabulary and sentence structures much more easily than those that don't. But the paper argues that this observation also reinforces the idea of underlying visual processing difficulties.
How so?
Because even if the language itself is somewhat familiar, an entirely new script can still present a significant hurdle. Less proficient readers, regardless of age actually, tend to rely more on using context and their existing knowledge of word meanings to guess at words they haven't fully and accurately decoded visually.
Oh, yeah.
This can be a useful coping mechanism, sure, but it also often indicates an underlying weakness in the automatic recognition of words themselves.
Okay. So, given all these potential challenges that adult learners face, what does the paper suggest about how we might improve reading skills and outcomes for them? What are the prospects, for getting better at reading as an adult?
Well, the central message here, I think, is the critical importance of helping adult learners reach a skill level where the act of reading feels relatively easy and less of a struggle. This could be absolutely key in combating those high dropout rates and preventing that relapse back into illiteracy that we talked about earlier. If reading is a more enjoyable and less frustrating experience, adults are naturally just more likely to persist and continue to improve.
That makes perfect sense. So, what specific kinds of teaching strategies might be particularly effective for adult learners who are grappling with these specific challenges?
The paper suggests building upon the existing strengths that adults often possess. Compared to young children, adults typically have a better developed understanding of sound letter correspondences and more sophisticated overall learning strategies.
Okay.
So, emphasizing phonics-based instruction, utilizing mnemonics, memory aids to help in memorizing unfamiliar letter shapes, and incorporating more writing activities to help solidify the visual patterns of letters could all be beneficial approaches.
Writing helps lock in the visual form.
Exactly. And engaging multiple senses in the learning process, what's sometimes called multi-channel learning, might also be particularly helpful for adults.
What about specifically addressing the issues of reading speed and accuracy, which seem to be major stumbling blocks for so many adult learners?
Well, the cornerstone of improvement in these areas is, as you might expect, extensive and consistent practice. No real surprise there.
Right, practice, practice, practice.
But the paper also suggests the explicit teaching of word segmentation skills, really focusing on breaking down words into their constituent parts. It also highlights something called the Morningside model of generative instruction,
Okay.
which basically involves breaking down complex skills into smaller, more manageable components and focusing on achieving high levels of accuracy and speed in each of those foundational skills. The underlying principle is that by mastering these fundamental elements, overall reading fluency will naturally improve.
It's like building a really solid foundation, brick by brick. If you can quickly and accurately recognize the individual letters and common letter patterns, the more complex aspects of reading might come more easily.
Precisely.
And what about that crucial issue of preventing that really disheartening relapse back into illiteracy?
Yeah, that's a big one. The paper recommends prioritizing the teaching of easily recognizable letters early on in the learning process. This helps build confidence and a sense of accomplishment right away.
Good idea.
Also, providing additional targeted practice for letters or letter combinations that tend to be sources of errors, and again, utilizing mnemonic devices for letters that are easily forgotten could also be valuable. The paper also points out, though, that more research is needed to systematically identify which letters or visual elements are most easily remembered or forgotten by adults in different languages and writing systems.
That's a really insightful point. Having a better understanding of which specific visual elements are harder for adults to retain could lead to much more precisely targeted and hopefully more effective instruction.
Absolutely. And incorporating metacognitive strategies could also be very valuable.
The metacognitive, meaning thinking about thinking.
Yeah, basically. It involves helping adults become more aware of their own perception of the new script and equipping them with specific strategies for improving their reading speed, maintaining comprehension, and actively monitoring for any signs of potential relapse.
So it sounds like a more conscious, strategic, and perhaps more personalized approach to learning might be particularly necessary and effective for adult learners.
Exactly. And while the importance of well-trained and effective teachers can't be overstated, the paper also suggests the potential of incorporating cognitively based learning activities directly into textbooks and teacher training materials, perhaps even using video demonstrations to model effective teaching techniques.
Right, making the insights accessible. It's all about understanding the potential perceptual challenges that adults face, and then designing instruction that directly and thoughtfully addresses those specific challenges. Finally, the paper outlines some really fascinating prospects for future research in this important area. What are some of the key questions that they propose investigating further?
Well, one of the primary areas for future research is to directly test this adult neoliterate dyslexia hypothesis that we've been discussing.
Okay, putting it to the
Yeah.
test.
This would involve carefully designed studies that teach new scripts to participants across a range of age groups, children, adolescents, and adults, and then meticulously measure the time it takes for them to achieve automaticity in reading. Researchers could also conduct detailed analyses of the learning process itself, perhaps utilizing, dual processing techniques and advanced brain imaging technologies like PET scans to actually see what's happening in the brain as people learn to read at different ages.
That kind of research would give us a much clearer picture, potentially, of the neurological processes involved in learning to read at different stages of life.
Definitely. Another crucial area is to conduct more research with both adults who are already literate in one script and with adults who are learning to read for the very first time in developing countries.
Right, compare those groups.
Yeah, this would help us to determine if the underlying challenges they face are similar or distinct and allow for more broadly applicable insights. Of course, there are logistical hurdles to overcome in conducting such research, finding participants, setting up studies in different contexts,
Searching complex.
but the potential for valuable discoveries is significant.
And what about the development and refinement of instructional strategies themselves? What kind of research is needed in that specific area?
The focus here would be on gaining a deeper understanding of how adults actually process letters. Things like identifying which specific letters or letter positions are most critical, understanding which visual patterns are inherently easier or more difficult to recognize, and maybe determining the optimal speed and accuracy needed at the individual letter level to facilitate the development of automatic word recognition.
Getting really granular.
Yeah, measuring reaction times to different letter stimuli could be a key component of this. Studies would also need to examine the acquisition of functional reading skills and overall comprehension. How does comprehension develop over time in adult learners? And also, the factors that contribute to that disheartening phenomenon of relapse into illiteracy.
Right. Why does that happen?
And the potential for interference between different writing systems. For those who already know one script, that's another intriguing area for investigation.
It sounds like a really comprehensive research agenda aimed at truly understanding the nuances of how adults learn to read and how we can best support them in that process.
And the paper also touches on a broader and very important question, I think. What are the wider cognitive benefits of adult literacy? Can adults who successfully learn to read later in life still gain the same kinds of cognitive advantages, changes in brain structure and function that are typically associated with learning to read in childhood?
That's a profound question. Does learning to read in adulthood have the same kind of rewiring effect on the brain as it does when a child learns to read?
That's precisely what further research could help us to understand. And while much of the initial research in this area might naturally be specific to particular languages and rating systems, the underlying principles governing how adults visually process print are likely to have broader applicability across different contexts.
Hopefully leading to generalizable findings.
Yeah. Ultimately, the goal of all this research, as the paper stresses, is really to better understand the potential obstacles that adults face when learning to read, and then to develop more effective and targeted ways to overcome those obstacles, thereby empowering more adults to access the transformative power of reading.
So to summarize our deep dive today, it really does appear that learning to read fluently can indeed be more challenging for adults, potentially due to age-related differences in how our brains perceive and process new visual information, like unfamiliar scripts.
Mm-hmm.
We see evidence of this both in the struggles faced by adults learning to read for the very first time and in the experiences of educated individuals tackling completely new writing systems.
And what's truly fascinating, I think, is the implication that the brain's capacity for automatically processing novel visual symbols for reading might become somewhat less adaptable or, less plastic after a certain stage in life.
Right. So, considering these really interesting insights, here's a provocative thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. What are the broader implications of these findings for how we approach adult education programs and maybe the overall value that we place on early literacy? Could a deeper understanding of these underlying perceptual challenges lead us to develop more effective and tailored teaching methods? And could that ultimately empower more adults to unlock the world of reading and all the opportunities it holds?
It's certainly something profound to think about.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.